Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Downey, Library and Information Services Coordinator here at the AWRI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. It's also my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Chris Penfold. Chris has been a researcher with the University of Adelaide for over 25 years now, initially in broadacre agronomy and for the last years in viticulture. His research has focused on the enhancement of system sustainability through investigating non-chemical weed control, under vine management and cover cropping systems. He has a strong interest in reintroducing native plants to the landscape, especially where they can provide multiple benefits to landholders and the environment. Now, his new project, funded by Wine Australia, is investigating the use of suitable plant species to improve soil health and vineyard profitability while reducing the need for herbicides in the under-vine zone of vineyards. But before I hand over to Chris to tell us a little bit more about this, a couple of quick notes on what you as the audience can expect from today's webinar. The format is a short PowerPoint style presentation followed by a Q&A. The session is being recorded and will be available to view later via the AWRI website. It's important to remember that webinars are interactive and that there are a number of ways you can get involved. To ask a question, please type into the question section of your control panel in the bottom right corner of your screen. Now, for those with access to a microphone, there is also the option of speaking directly with our presenter by clicking the raise hand button. This is located in the top left section of your control panel. And if you prefer to ask a question via email, please do so at infoservices@awri.com.au. Please send through your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A, I'll get as many questions through to Chris as possible. Finally, if you'd like to get involved through Twitter, please use the Twitter handle @_AWRI. Okay, that's enough from me for now. I'm going to hand over to Chris to get us started.
Hello all. Thank you very much for joining us. This is a new one to me, presenting a webinar. I hope it's going to be a useful exercise for you that are listening at the other end. So I work with the university and thank them for having employed me for the last 25 years with funding, much of that time from you guys, the operators out there that are being levied, and through Wine Australia we are funded for our present project as well, which is all very much appreciated. I've included my email address on this opening slide, so there's no doubt going to be some questions from you that can't be answered today. So please get in contact with me. I will be away for the next couple of weeks, but I'll try and get back to you as quickly as I can with any queries you might have. So to get into the presentation, talking about vineyard cover cropping, we're talking here, and we're going to be looking at, due to the necessity of the topic we're talking of, we cover many regions, so we can't be prescriptive, I don't suppose, on what we can suggest as a particular cover crop for a particular region through this presentation. That's much more up to individuals as to how they go about it. We'll give you some leads though as to how you might proceed with that. But in a general sense, we'll have a look at cover crops and you know what our mid-rows are really about. So in this slide we're talking about you need to have access to the vines in all sorts of conditions. They need to look as you want them to look, I suppose, and that differs between individuals and between regions and so on as to whether it's a very tourist-orientated area and they need to have things looking pristine, or whether you are willing to let things look a little bit so-called untidy, but which might have substantial benefits in other directions such as biodiversity or root development in the crops and that sort of thing, rather than being mown all the time. There's certainly a source of water in many regions, but not all. I mean, when we get up into our dry inland region, there's not much in the way of water storage capacity in those mid-row areas, and we're very reliant on what comes out of the drippers. And so what we do in the mid-rows in that area is quite different from what we might do in a much higher rainfall country. source of nutrients as well, and we can produce nutrients in the midrows through the growth of legumes, and we can utilise those nutrients one way or another, either by leave them in situ or throwing them to the side as a source of mulch. We can also look at the midrows as a source of income in some situations, and certainly with the increased utilisation of sheep as management tools for the vineyard floor, it becomes a source of fodder for them. And if you're serious about grazing and trying to come out with reasonable productivity in those sheep over that winter, early spring period, then what we grow there can certainly have an influence on their productivity. Certainly a source of seeds. Some people are growing native grass in the vineyard are harvesting those seeds, and quite a valuable sort of side income. Or produce in some areas where they might look at particularly summer crops grown in the midrow. You certainly do see people growing pumpkins and that sort of thing down there. Certainly a very valuable source of habitat for beneficials, and particularly in areas where light brown apple moth might be a problem. What we do there in the spring-summer period can also be important for keeping them under control. But for many people, the midrows have a fair nuisance value as well, and trying to contain weeds there, it all comes at a bit of a cost and an annoyance. So just to start off, we can look at the bad old days of how we used to do it. A photo from the Barossa some years ago, and where anything that was not a vine that was green was seen as a weed and had to be destroyed. So we end up with these dust mulches. Not bad for containing water in the profile, but you certainly wouldn't want to be talking about it from a soil health perspective as being anything desirable. Rotary hoed on a regular basis, was pulverised and tried to stop evaporation from the soil surface. But we've certainly moved on from there a long way in recent times. To look at the dry inland areas where we might have a situation like this. Fortunately, at this vineyard, their cedar broke down very early in the vineyard's life, and they parked in the shed and didn't do any more, and they were able to utilise the seed reserves in the soil, which have just allowed a nice diverse sward of native plant species ideally suited to the environment to come back. They provide great habitat for beneficials, and it takes very little to manage it. One pass with a roller or slasher a year, and that's about it. So like I said at the beginning, it's very much a horses for courses, depending on region as to how we look at these midrow management. Or we can look like this down south, where it's just barley grass, regenerating sward, bounces back of its own accord from its own seed reserves every year very readily. It's a nice short season grass. It costs nothing except a slashing once or twice a year, very, very cheap and easy. But once again, you need the seed reserves there to start with. Back in the dry inland region again, this is at Swan Hill, a vineyard where caltrop was a major problem. Some people don't see caltrop as a problem, but for those that do, this is Atriplex semibacata, creeping saltbush, and as you can see, a stand which established really well with some good rains in November, and provides a fantastic cover of the soil and smothers out that caltrop very, very effectively. And in this region where we're applying reasonable amounts of water to the vines, you can see the big canopies there, the midrow has virtually no impact on vine productivity. It's quite a separate entity. Those wheel tracks and where the water's coming from make it, what we're doing in the midrow, quite irrelevant to what's happening in the vines, except for things like provision of habitat for beneficials and looking after the weed issues. Or in this case down the Coonawarra, where we've planted wallaby grass, Astrodanthonia, and it's established really well. These old Shiraz vines are not influenced at all by having that as a midrow cover crop. They're quite happy to work or to live with it. They're in the same environment, once again providing some habitat and very good competition against plants like in this case wireweed, which just don't get a look in. Or we can have a look up in the higher rainfall country where we are looking to have that biodiversity happening. This is a photo from Tom Ayres up in Adelaide Hills, and growing buckwheat. And that's certainly been promoted in some environments as being a great source of the food for beneficials. back in the Barossa, and a great crop of medic mixed in with some ryegrass. A fantastic combination, really good for developing soils, improving soil health, great source of nitrogen, and it regenerates of its own accord every year. It looks after itself pretty well. And so then it comes down to how we might manage these things, and we can talk about that a little bit soon. So as you can see, and as you're well aware, there's a huge diversity of cover crop species out there. We can't cover them in their entirety in the session. To help out though, Cass Collins and I put together this decision support tool a couple of years ago. It's all available on the web, covercropfinder.com.au, as you can see at the top of the screen there. It's designed to based on your minimum rainfall, and also whether you're looking to go for perennials or annuals in your system. And then there's some check boxes there as to what you are wanting from the cover crop. You check those that you are interested in, submit the inquiry, and it will come up with some options for you. You'll also see on the midway down on the right hand side in the links section under cover crops, there's a chapter there from Phil Nichols' book on soil irrigation and nutrition, co-written by Richard Porter, who did a lot of work on cover cropping some years ago when he was with Seedco. And there's a lot of good information there on the various crops and their establishment and their value and so on. So all worth a look for you. Like I said, if there's any queries that come out of this session, please get back to me afterwards so we can talk about it further. Just a little bit more about cover cropping, and this sort of thing is becoming increasingly pertinent as we get our pretty dry springs. Things like this work from Colin McDonald, Tappas Biswath and Rob Harrington over in Western Australia a few years ago. And there they were looking at the width of the cover crop and the influence it has on the vine vegetative growth, as shown by the pruning weights on the y-axis, and particularly in 2007, which was a dry year over there. And on the y-axis we've got no cover crop on the far left-hand side, going across to 0.8 of a metre, 1.6 of a metre, or 2.4 metres wide, so pretty much the full width of the mid-row. And you can see the decline in pruning weights as we go across. We are certainly capable of having a significant influence on the vine vigour in some situations by what we're doing in the middle. But we can also influence that by the species we grow. In this case, from work from I did up at Clare with the CRCV years ago. Our yield on the y-axis, and this is in a fairly vigorous site. And with triticale, which was mulched at budburst, compared to clover, chicory and ryegrass, which were allowed to go through to their own senescence, we certainly were dragging the moisture out fairly effectively with those, and certainly reducing yield considerably by doing so. So once again, you can influence things quite considerably by the species which you're including there. The herbicide here, that wasn't herbicide at budburst, that was a little bit later, so hence we've taken up a bit more water than what the triticale did. There's some work from South Africa, AWRI over there. Much of what we're talking about here is sustainability and how we might improve soil health. There's, from this work, when he was able to obtain funding for 10 years, which was rather remarkable, and which is really necessary though to look at changes in things like soil organic matter, because it doesn't happen very quickly. But he was able to determine from this work that with this range of species, oats, rye, vetch, favour beans, 2 different medics and the subclover, that over that period they all increased the soil organic matter. The legumes, and you really do need a strong legume component in order to be able to increase it at any reasonable sort of rate. So this is in a reasonable rainfall zone, about 500 to 600 mils on a medium textured soil. What we're seeing here is probably not going to work, or definitely won't work to the same extent in our drier inland environs. But he was able to make a significant difference on soil organic matter compared to a regenerated sward, which was controlled chemically, and also compared to a mechanical control of a regenerated sward, which is actually going backwards. So in those cases you are effectively oxidising the organic matter in just the same way as that opening slide was oxidising the organic matter through rotary hoeing. In this case, they'll be doing the same with the disc. You're exposing that organic matter to microbial degradation, and you lose it as carbon dioxide. And just to emphasise that a little bit more, was the slide from back in the Barossa from some years ago. So this is taken during summer. That was a nice cover crop in spring, which was mown with a slasher. So we're chopping that cover crop up into nice fine pieces, which all looks good. But it's a bit like feeding hay to a horse compared to feeding chaff to a horse. The reason why you chaff it is so that the microbes in the gut can access the nutrients contained in that hay or chaff much better. Here you're doing the same sort of thing, but in reverse, in effect, where you get a rainfall event on a finely chopped cover crop, and quickly those microbes attack it and mineralise it, and away goes the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you're left with very little at the end. So can we do that better? And a lot of people are now adopting this. In this case, I've gone through, this is a barley cover crop with a sponge wiper for a start, with some glyphosate in it, just to knock it back a little bit. Those vines were coming into bud, so I didn't want to use any spray on there. So this is a Schmucker wiper, and then come through afterwards. This is actually an oats, but with a roller. I wouldn't advocate putting a roller behind a bike like this. It's pretty hard work, and you can remove the drawbar fairly easily. But there's lots of options out there for rolling, and we can certainly help out with that if people are interested. It's a simple way to knock down the cover crop of many forms. It doesn't have to be cereals. Certainly brassicas respond well to it. Even medics and clovers and that sort of thing can be set back fairly well. And it's a good cheap way of doing it. If you've got a fairly even floor, it works really nicely. So you end up with a nice mulch on the soil surface like this, where the integrity of that cover crop has been maintained. It doesn't break down nearly as quickly, and that will certainly inhibit things like, in this case, where we've just intentionally turned off the cedar. There's a lot of wireweed, hairy panic, and a few other things growing there instead. So I think the barley mulch is probably a preferred way to go. But with all this, there's costs involved. Russell Johnson and Dan Falkenberg from the Barossa did some costings on looking at 3 different cover crop options, in this case native grasses. I won't go into detail on all these costings, but please revisit them when you have a chance if you want to. But so with the native grasses, one of the main costs there is the seed. It can be around $70 a kilo or so, and you're often sowing it at 10 kilos a hectare at a minimum. So that initial upfront cost can be fairly expensive, but these are perennials, so we can amortise that cost over several years. So right down the bottom there, you can see the average cost per year is about $230 per hectare. For a green manure cover crop, what we talked about earlier on, so growing in this case triticale, putting in 100 kilos of DAP with it, which is probably unnecessary because you've put in more than likely plenty of DAP in the past, so you could, in many cases, very high levels of particularly phosphorus in these mid-rows. You don't really need it. But anyway, so that's the way they've gone about it. A variety of herbicides and so on that have gone to set it up beforehand, and then for undervine as well. And 3 rotary hoeings, hugely costly, cultivation as well. So we're up to over $500 a hectare for the bad old days of green manuring like that. Were you to remove the rotary hoe and the cultivator and just slash it, well, that cost will come back considerably, and probably even more so if you were to roll it. And managing the volunteer growth, well, even that comes with a cost as well. And we are talking the undervine area here too, but about $260 odd just for 3 slashings in this case, and an amount of herbicide that's going in there. So, as I suggested at the outset, we're not coming up with any prescriptions here for you by any means as to how to implement the cover crops. It's very much for your particular requirements in your particular region as to what you do there, but there are certainly plenty of options out there, all with their associated costs as to what you put in and also how you manage it. So I believe that certainly the permanent, if you can do it, or self-regenerating swards such as emetics and clovers and that sort of thing are a great way to go. Certainly improving soil health as well as having species which are going to fit generally in with the vineyard system very nicely. But I do put in that warning there about the perennials and these critical moisture reserves. You need to be very careful on what you look at. A species which I'm working with a bit at the moment in the undervine area, but I think it's got potential in the mid-rows as well, is Caspar cocksfoot, which is a summer dormant species when grown without irrigation, and that could also work quite nicely, I think. But it is a perennial, so it has a dormancy mechanism there in order to survive those harsh summers. So, and managing the cover crop to suit the season. So if you do one day get a wet season, maybe you can let things go. The beauty of having these self-regenerating swards is that once you have a good seed bank established, then you can take them out early if you need to, if it's a dry season, and there'll still be the seed bank there for them to recover in the following season. If you want to let them go, then they can, and you can re-establish that seed bank again. So there's once again options there as to how you go about it. But I am going to move on now to another area of cover cropping, which is my new project. This is with undervine cover cropping, and just introduce you to this project, which started in early 2014. We had a pretty rugged spring that year. This last spring was also pretty rugged, but we seem to get some pretty good establishment. So what we're trying to do is have a look at this undervine area, which has historically been kept, as you see, as a bare area. As soon as you have bare ground, though, it's laying it open to weeds to come in and try and repopulate it. So what I'm trying to do, in conjunction with Melanie Weckett from Wagga, who is looking after the soil biology aspect of this, is to repopulate this undervine area with desired rather than undesirable species to hopefully have a benefit to the vine. We have a lot of fairly hostile soils in that undervine area, particularly after they've been going without anything in the way of vegetation for a long time, often pretty hard, so it makes root access by the vines pretty difficult. So we want to try and restore those undervine soils by growing preferred species there without upsetting our yields and quality in the process, and make things cheaper ultimately for the growers. So the way we've done that in the past is things like putting mulch out. In the case straw mulch, there's other mulches available, coarsely composted mulches and that sort of thing. But it's all fairly expensive. It's all another pass. You know, they last 3 or 4 years and have to redo it and so on. So can we actually create our own mulch without having a significant detrimental impact on the vines? So this is one of 7 sites which I have. This one's in the Barossa, at the AWRI Research Station. We have others at Clare, Waikerie, Coonawarra, Eden Valley, Langhorne Creek and McLaren Vale. And I thank those operators very much for their involvement in this. As you can see here, we have 10 different treatments at each site, all replicated. Straw on the left, that's triticale. On the right, it's a clover mix. Then there's some medic further down. And this last year, in most sites, they perform fairly well. The way I've been sowing it is I have a little cedar which I tow behind the bike, and just sow 1 row up within about 20 centimetres of the vine butts, and let them go. We're also having a look at barley. This is the Eden Valley site, so barley on the left-hand side, which was taken out early with herbicides, versus on the right, where I've just let it go through the head, and there's another one which was taken out in between times, which I thought might be just an easy one potentially for growers to implement. It's cheap seed, it's pretty vigorous, it tends to smother out weeds fairly effectively, and I think that maybe we can have a look at this and we can run along there alongside the vines with a roller and lay it down as a mulch over the summer period. So we'll be doing some more work on that one this year. Langhorne Creek, where we have this Caspar cocksfoot, and here it's perenniating in a green form with that irrigation water being applied, and as we'll see, it's certainly knocked back the yields fairly effectively over that by being green over the summer period. A Volpia or silvergrass, wallaby grass, On the left-hand side, it's strawberry clover, also responding very nicely to the irrigation being applied. At this site, we're putting on over 3 megs of water, and so they're getting a good drink, and the casbar on the right. And this is a medic combination underneath the vines, a fantastic growth that we had there up over the dripper line, and a beautiful mulch. It's naturally senesced, it hasn't been sprayed out. It's just gone through to its own maturity and mulched down like it has. And just some quick hot off the press results. So here we have at the Langhorne Creek site. You can see on the left-hand side here, so that cocksfoot and the strawberry clover have certainly knocked back our yields. This is a Cabernet site where those yields are down to 15 tonne. Our top yield is over 25 tonne. And going through here, but of interest is the control, which was just glyphosated out, and the triticale straw mulch. Now these are insignificant differences, but at the top of the line though, we do have a mix of 2 medic varieties, which was significantly higher than the clover and the casbar down at the other end. So it would appear as though we are getting a mulching effect from that medic senescing and just laying on the surface, but also we think there might be something happening below ground as well, where we're able to enhance the uptake of water and nutrients by the application of these desirable species. And at Nuriutpa, where we also got some pretty good results as well for the medic and so this ryegrass and medic mixed together, compared to the triticale mulch, which was the highest yield, just on 10 tonnes or close to 10 tonnes. Down a little bit was the medic ryegrass and the control, all in that similar sort of league, and a couple of other medics here as well. So I mean they are looking fairly promising at the moment, and considering this is a dry spring and these went right through to maturity, they weren't sprayed out, I think there's something happening there which we don't understand completely at the moment. I mean, when we have a look at gypsum block data between the triticale mulch and the ryegrass medic mix, once that medic had senesced, the soil moisture profiles were very similar between the triticale mulch and the ryegrass medic combination. So there's something happening down below ground which is leading to some fairly useful sorts of outcomes at the end. We're also making wine from this, so we'll be looking forward to doing a tasting on that in time. And Melanie Weckett, in her role, is doing some great work with next-gen sequencing, so trying to get a handle on what's happening with the bugs in the ground, also microbial biomass and mycorrhizae and so on. So in time, there's going to be some really interesting outcomes, I think, from this work. Just to finish off with, here we are at one of our other sites at AWRI, so where we've grown, in this case, medics underneath the vine, and they've just worked to promote the growth of their endemic weeds. We have prickly lettuce and I'm trying to think of it, I can't think of it at the moment, sorry, I've lost that one. Fleabane is the primary weeds there, and a nice little mix of that. We prefer not to have them. Can we get around it? Yes, we can. This is the casbar cocksfoot, which has reduced the yields elsewhere, but it also very effectively kept out all those weeds. There's hardly a weed to be seen in the 3 panels of each plot. It's quite fantastic. So assuming that they are drying out the soil, preventing any germination of those very small seeds coming from the fleabane and the prickly lettuce, and that's worked very effectively. Unfortunately though, we also suffered a 14% yield loss where this is growing. So the research has to continue to try and get around that yield loss while still maintaining that effective weed barrier. So with that, thank you very much for all of you for attending, and thank you very much to the people who support this work, and including the seed companies and the wonderful viticultural groups in the regions that help get this information out there. So I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Chris. As Chris has just mentioned, we will move from here into a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please start sending them through. Chris is going to stick around and answer them. Just a reminder, there are a couple of ways you can ask a question. You can type the question into your control panel and click to send it through. If you have a microphone and you'd like to speak directly with Chris, please click the raise hand button, which is in the left top section of your control panel. There's also the option of sending a question via email at infoservices@awri.com.au. So I haven't got any questions right now, but as I said, Chris is going to stick around for a while, and we'll see how we go.
I have a question here from Neil, and it is for new vineyard establishment. Do you have comments on annual versus perennial? Thanks for that, Neil, and I would be very cautious about perennials in those early days of establishment. It is so important to be able to get vines away with as least amount of stress on them as possible, and I think going down the perennial line or just working with what's there naturally, the regenerated sward, until things get away. I learned that very quickly with trials of natives at AWRI, where there was fairly young vines as well, and where I tried that Naturalplex semibacata, the prostrate saltbush. There we dragged back yields by 50% from having a fairly aggressive summer active plant in there. So it may be with things like the Casmar cocksfoot, which is meant to be summer dormant in a rain-fed situation, that you could get away with that. But I would still, I think, err on the side of caution and stick with the annuals for a start. I have another question here from Paul, and are you monitoring salt leaching with the different undervine cover crops? An interesting one, Paul, and no, we're not. We are monitoring a lot of other things. It'd be interesting to talk with you about that. And certainly some of the sites are potentially sodic, and so we could be looking at a change in profiles by the implementation of these cover crops. I mean, if we are improving infiltration, for instance, by improving our soil structure, then we might be looking at the movement of salt down the profile. That is yet to be seen. We haven't done any infiltration measurements yet. So yes, I look forward to having a chat with you about that as to how we might look at that further. And a question here from Alana, do you know if yield decreases due to berry size only? It was also due to bunch numbers as well, Alana. So I guess I need to look into that a little bit further, whether we are inducing stress from these undervine cover crops in some situations at the time of bud initiation. We could be, and so that might be upsetting our bunch numbers. We do need to look into that further for sure. But often it wasn't berry size at all, it was more bunch numbers.
Thanks for your questions there, Neil, Paul and Alana. That's all we have for now. Chris, did you want to make any final comments before we wrap up, or are you happy to leave it there?
I'd just like to thank Michael very much for coordinating this. I think it's a wonderful mechanism for getting some information out to you growers, and thank you for your involvement. And yes, please follow it up further if you want any more information.
Thanks very much for that, Chris. Yeah, big thank you goes out to Chris for coming in and presenting today. Very much appreciated. For attendees, you will receive a follow-up email. This email will contain a link to a survey, and it'll also contain a link to the recording for today's session. Now, the next AWRI webinar is on May 5th, where Tim Pitt from SARDI will provide some information around redirecting rain to manage soil salinity. If you'd like to register for this webinar, please visit the AWRI website. But that's all we have for today. Thank you again for attending, and I look forward to seeing you again at the next AWRI webinar.